Black Sky author, Musury copywriting Desperado X Svenskum in 5711 of the new Gregorian calendar. Office number 5 of the security building received 3 break-in messages from the space prison. My dear, I'm looking at you. Don't be nervous, it's just on the big screen of the prison. Suddenly I am looking forward to seeing you again. Will you greet me with a smile or give me a shot? Truss sat behind a large desk, read the message with his face unchanged, and replied, if you remember correctly, your imprisonment period is as long as the life of the planet. So unfortunately, there is no such day. Unless the end of the world, the planet exploded. However, 2 years later, the planet really exploded. Chus. Notification bar. This wonderful setting is exaggerated, nonsense, nonsense, the kind of nonsense that Einstein's coffin board cannot hold. Look at the magic of space, 1 vs 1, he. Content tag, strong fantasy space, happy enemies future overhead protagonists, Chu Si, SAE young supporting roles, Zhang-Chi, Esther, Kim, etc. Others, strong, Interstellar, brief comment on works in 5713 of the new Gregorian calendar. The Sky Eagle Gamma star suddenly exploded, and people had to forcibly freeze themselves to avoid disaster. Due to a malfunction of the frozen capsule, the protagonist Truth woke up early and was approached by a terrorist as soon as he opened his eyes. They met when they were young and killed each other as adults. Under such extreme circumstances, they were forced to become teammates. From now on there is no peace. When the well-dressed Truss meets desperados, what kind of sparks will collide, how will they wander through the chaos of all parties, and how can they save the fallen homeland? The author uses vivid words to depict a unique interstellar world, and also creates a pair of brilliant combinations, humorous and worth reading. Volume 1 Dust. God once gazed at this sea of stars, he slept here, and woke up here. Esther Neverland. This piece of black cedar forest has been lingering for a long time, the needles withered and hung down mournfully, but magically did not exude the sour and bitter smell of rotten wood. The woody fragrance that lingers in the forest all the year round still floats quietly, hiding 25 single-person frozen capsules in the depths of the pine forest. The frozen capsules were arranged in a neat square, and the sealed glass cover was covered with frost. One of the alarm sounds was so sharp that it cut through the silence of the deep forest. Insufficient energy, malfunction. Warning, the frozen capsule is about to stop working, please replenish energy within 5 seconds. Countdown, 5. 4 3 2 1. No new energy is detected, the frozen capsule is off. Before the word closed was finished, the electronic sound without ups and downs had stopped abruptly. Puff! The sound of the metal chassis stopping running sounded like a leak, and the frost on the glass cover faded at a speed visible to the naked eye under the influence of the emergency warming system, revealing a handsome but pale face in the capsule. The thin frost on his brow bones made him look shockingly cold and lifeless, as if he had been sleeping here for a long time and would never wake up again. However, almost the next second after the frost faded, those beautiful curved eyes opened without warning. To be honest, although this pile of metal lumps used to freeze the human body is called a capsule, its shape has nothing to do with the capsule. They are very unpleasant, wide on the top and narrow on the bottom. They are hexagons with faces longer than horses. When a person lay inside, it was a well-made coffin with specifications and standards. When the design drawings first came out, Truth was busy dealing with a riot in the space prison. He didn't close his eyes for 3 days, and he was so sleepy. The unlucky designer knocked on the door of his office and put a thick pile of drawings on his desk. According to the regulations, all documents of the frozen capsules must be reviewed and approved by the Chief Executive Officer of Office Number 5 of the security building, and signed before proceeding, including the design drawings. And Chu Si happened to be the Chief Executive in Office 5. He closed his eyes as soon as he saw the thickness of the drawing. In the description of the designer's wild flowers, he simply turned to the last page and signed it. On the day the finished product came out, he was wearing a well-tailored shirt and sitting in the meeting room on the top floor of the security building, listening to the old guy's scolding design with grace and calm expression. They sprayed for 2 full hours. This didn't change his face when he heard it. Not only did he have no introspection, but he tapped the table and said with a smile, "The planet's lifespan is still very long. I will lie down unless you are ugly." Make the old guys angry enough. As a result, within 5 years of saying this, the planet exploded. He really lay in this ugly frozen coffin, and it can be seen that the has been doing too much, and God can't see it. This is probably called retribution. Truss coughed dully under the glass cover for a while, coughing out the coldness in his lungs, then moved his fingers and broke the safety lock in the cabin. The muscles and bones all over his body were still very stiff, and it took a long time to push a hatch. The feeling of stepping on the ground was too long. He staggered backwards, and simply leaned against the frozen capsule. Half a step away, the other frozen capsule is still operating normally, and 2 lines of words are displayed on the glass cover: Gallo time 13 hours 20 minutes and 7 seconds, temperature in the capsule, -206 degrees Celsius at 13 o'clock. It was the time when the sun was the highest in the afternoon, but there was a sea of stars above my head, and the surroundings were as silent as the night. Truth looked around and took a deep breath. The air was so stuffy, he clearly came out of the freezing capsule, but he still seemed to be covered by something. Even breathing was uncomfortable, and he didn't know if he had frozen his lungs. Click! Suddenly behind him came the sound of fragile needles, like being stepped on by something. Who? Chus turned his head abruptly. He hadn't spoken for a long time, and his voice was a little dumb. As he asked, his fingers had already habitually touched his waist. Thankfully, I was too rushed when I entered the frozen capsule, and the gun was still unloaded. He pushed the safety bolt, and the sound of click appeared very crisp in the silence. Don't! I'll come out! Don't shoot!" A dark thing came out from behind a frozen capsule, like a round-head mop, the kind that has been marinated in a mud pit for 2 years. Chu Si squinted his eyes for a moment and found it hard to find a pair of eyes on the mop Simeon who hadn't taken care of his hair and beard for a long time. Who else? Chus's finger was still on the trigger. Mop hesitated for a moment, maintaining the surrender posture with his hands high, turning his head and muttering something. The other small Mop sticks out his head cautiously. The little Mop turned his face and glanced at the big Mop, and raised his hands in a similar manner. Calm down, calm down. Just the 2 of us, no one else," the big Mop said, staring at his gun. "I'm calm," Truth replied. "To be honest, I don't believe it very much. After all, I was so hungry that I wanted to eat people when I crawled out of the frozen capsule." The Mop's voice was a little suspicious. Chu Si looked cold. "If I can't find anyone cleaner than you, I might be more inclined to starve to death." The Mop was blocked, and it was a bit regretful. "In fact, we haven't cleaned it for half a year. Can you move the muzzle a little bit? In fact, this gun has been frozen in the freezer capsule for a long time, and the ghost knows if it will work." But Chus is a bastard, and he doesn't mind frightening the big man of unknown origin for a while, so he replied, "It depends on the mood." "Then how are you feeling now?" Mop asked. "Not great, it's too boring here," Chus said calmly. "To be precise, the air here is stuffy and irritating and physiological." The Mop stretched the tune and gave an "oh," and immediately became discouraged. "It's a pity, there is no way, after all, we have been bored for a long time." He turned his head and glanced at his wrist. Truth then noticed that something on his wrist was shining blue, like the screen of a smart watch. "Do you mind if I touch it?" The Mop stared at Truth's gun for fear that it would go wrong. Truth was non-committal, and the Mop boldly touched the screen. The cold electronic sound suddenly rang, enough to make Chu Si hear clearly: "Ground temperature, new 5 degrees Celsius, humidity, dry warning, the oxygen content is seriously lower than normal, and there are still 32 minutes and 57 seconds to the critical value. This kind of alarm is no stranger to Truss. He has heard these words in various safety test reports. The so-called oxygen content threshold corresponds to the survival limit. Once below the critical value, people will soon suffocate to death. The mop's voice was a little depressed. Look, even if you don't shoot, we still have less than 33 minutes of life. When Chu Si heard the words, his eyes moved. Not appropriate. The design concept of these freezer capsules is very special. All energy is converted from exhaust gas, and the exhaust gas contains oxygen. This design is to maintain survival to a certain extent. These principles and functions have been made public. Mop noticed Chu Si's gaze. He followed the frozen capsules on the ground and said, "I know what you are thinking, but it's useless. It's been 50 years, and the balance has long been unable to maintain." Truth finally had a look on his face. How many years? The mop seemed to have found a breakthrough. Decisively touching the watch screen, the mechanical electronic sound rang again. It's 5763 in the new Gregorian calendar, April 29, Garo time. Before the report was finished, the mop choked off the time report and muttered, "Be considerate, you have to save some electricity." However, Chus didn't even notice what he was talking about. 5763? He clearly remembered what the evening of December 27, 5713 was like. The golden red light of the setting sun softened the cold black cedar forest. He stood by the window, talking to the nursing doctor, while turning over himself. Private communication channel. In the last second, he was still watching the message sent by a dangerous person in the space prison forcibly, and the next second he received an alarm. The geocentric energy response process suddenly accelerated due to unknown reasons, and out of control. The expansion rate far exceeded the upper limit, and the estimated evacuation time was 3 minutes and 11 seconds. In layman's terms, the planet is going to explode. Everyone runs away. He will never forget how the ground vibrated and cracked during the chaotic 3 minutes, how they started the fragmentation plan against time, and how they evacuated from the villa to the frozen capsule in the cedar forest. Everything is vividly visible, as if the next day, as if he just slept in the capsule all night. But when I woke up, 50 years had passed. Perhaps it was a moment of surprise that caused a change in the heart rate and increased oxygen consumption. After the astonishment, Truss only felt that his surroundings became more boring. Mop took a look at his expression, and then aggrieved, "Don't take a deep breath. Don't take a deep breath. There are not enough mouthfuls. Don't forget, we only have more than 30 minutes left. Do you have any idea?" "I compare stupid, I haven't come up with any idea after waking up for 3 years. I don't want to die so early. The method of suffocation is too difficult. This person is a silly talker, and he has a headache for endless talk, making him confused about the status quo, and can't think of any way." Quiet. Just as he threw 2 words coldly, something in the pocket of his trousers shook. Truth was taken aback, stretched out his hand and touched it out. Only then did he remember that when he evacuated the frozen capsule, he had thrown the communicator he was holding into his pocket. The communicator does not consume more energy than a watch. It will be a miracle that the energy-saving model lasts for 50 years. The vibration just now indicates that the battery is insufficient, and it will be shut down soon. He was about to close and throw it back in his pocket, when he saw an unread message on the screen that he didn't know when. Truth's eyebrows jumped immediately. Without looking at the content, he could guess who the information came from. After all, he dared to use his private communication channel as his own garden. Sure enough, the information comes from the space prison. "My dear executive officer, I have great news for you. I escaped from prison. Sae Young Chus. Damn great news. The author has something to say. Special reminder, this article is not science fiction, there is no mech, and the whole article is nonsense. When it comes to the kind of old Einstein's coffin that can't be held, don't think about it with common sense. Magical fairy tales look better. Okay, note, Esther's Neverland, there is no such book. If this understated message were seen by the old guys in the 9 offices of the security building, it would be time to line up to save the heart. The slower the effect of the medicine is, it will be able to pass more than half of it on the spot. Just watching these 2 words, Chu Si was able to stand upright on the spot. But even he felt dark in front of him, and the feeling of hypoxia became more serious. The space prison, which has been in exile for 100 years, has been under the supervision and management of Office Number 5 of the security building since its initial completion. There are the most dangerous group of people on the planet. It is not an exaggeration to say that it is a demon concentration camp. Picking up one of them is random bombs. An SAE Young is the most troublesome one in history, the kind whose explosive equivalent value cannot be estimated. It took 17 years just to trap him in jail, and how he was finally controlled has always been a mystery to the outside world. Even if this dangerous man is trapped in space, he is still an unconscious master. Since he was in prison, no year has passed. The chief executive officer of Office Number 5 has thus been reduced to the most terrible position, declining almost every 3 years. It wasn't until chess came up that this curse-like effect could end. If it wasn't for the people in front to withdraw too quickly, at his age, it would be impossible for him to sit in such a high position. About his face is already ugly to the extreme. The mop looked at his finger on the trigger, swallowed, and tilted his head to the side calmly. You look bad, what did you receive? Is the bad news? Chu Si lifted his eyes and glanced at him. It's unprecedented bad. Do you know the space prison? Mop gave a dry smile. Of course, my brother is still the prison guard there. Your face looks like a group of demons came out of the wall. Chu Si shook the communicator in his hand and said blankly, I would rather see other people escape from prison collectively than this. Mop's mouth twitched. It sounds terrible, or should we suffocate and die? Chus said coldly, you are so promising. The mop secretly reached out to take the small mop next to him, and said, I saw such terrible bad news with you, and it is barely a common misfortune. Can you put the gun down first? We really have no malice. Chus put the gun back to his waist, and the mop immediately let out a sigh of relief, and then he grabbed the small mop and walked a few steps closer. As expected, the 2 people who hadn't cleaned up for half a year, scented their noses in every move, like a humanoid biochemical weapon sent by God to torture him. The smell was so refreshing, it made Truth's heart beat, and then he remembered one thing he forgot to see when the message was received. One step closer, you can say goodbye to your toes. Chus shook the gun at random, opened his mouth to stop the mop that he wanted to get in, and swiped his eyes on the communicator twice. On the interface, under Sahi's message, the time is clearly displayed, February 18, 5736. Truth closed his eyes and opened them again. His face is even more ugly. That's right, he didn't look back, it was 36 instead of 63. What a great thing, it's been 27 years since the time it took to receive this message. In 27 years, building a spacecraft to fly out of the galaxy is enough, and it's a fart. Sometimes, when things are so bad that they are irreparable, there is nothing to worry about. The planet exploded into countless fragments, and they became a bit of dust in the vast sea of stars. The space prison is far beyond the range he can monitor now. The most troublesome dangerous element has been running for 27 years, and there is something worse than this. What's the situation? Gone. Mop couldn't see what Truth's momentary stupefaction was thinking, but shook the watch in front of him uneasily. The wind rushed from the action, and the fragrance was horrible. Truth, if you think 2 hands are getting in the way, I don't mind breaking one for you. The mop whizzed back his hand. No, I just want to remind you, 2 more minutes have passed. We only have 30 minutes left, don't you feel dizzy? Chus frowned. You make me dizzy. However, although he disliked the smell of the mop, he did not ignore his words. Instead of worrying about how to tie back an explosive that has been running for 27 years, it is better to make sure that you can see the sun tomorrow. Stars are fine too. He turned his face and glanced around. Except for the aged soil and rotten needles in the black cedar forest, there were only these 25 frozen capsules. Through the decadent branches, one could faintly see a silent black shadow a little far away, lying quietly under the sea of stars. Oh yes, there is a villa over there. The oxygen is too thin, and the mop talks a lot and gasps slightly. He squatted down with the frozen capsule nearby, leaning against the air outlet of the capsule base, trying to make himself more comfortable. Before the explosion, government officials occasionally came to take a vacation. I don't know which department it was from. Of course he knew what Chus said, because he was the chief who occasionally came back on vacation. For some unavoidable reasons, he will live here for a week every 6 months, with doctors, nutritionists, and some guards. Now these people are all lying in the frozen capsule next to him. Luckier than him, the energy has not been exhausted, so they are still sleeping. It can be said that the people living in this area are his people, but he has never seen 2 mops of these sizes. If I remember correctly, there are no other residents here, Truth said. The mop was almost stuffing his nose into the fumarole. He half held the mop and explained, you know, there are only a few people living here every year, the scenery is good, and the air is good, so we occasionally come quietly. Camp for a few days. Chus said, oh, come camping in December when it's cold enough to freeze the bones. Mop said annoyed, yes, this is probably the biggest mistake I have made in my life. It just happened that someone didn't say anything about the villa, and I also encountered the end of the day. After he finished speaking, he glanced at his watch again. There are still 27 minutes, are you sure we want to continue discussing how I camped? I'm so dizzy now that I can't think about it. Can you really think of a way? Chus raised his foot and kicked him twice. Of course there is a way. It's just that he needs to confirm whether these 2 people are really harmless. Is 27 minutes enough? Mop seemed a little unbelievable. Truth replied, more than enough, as long as you can move your legs. When the fragmentation plan was prepared, this place was classified as one of the execution areas. Considering that when the planet collapses, the villa may partially collapse, so most of the frozen capsules are placed in this pine forest. The villa is not far away, and it is convenient to evacuate. But in fact, there are 9 spare capsules in the villa, which are placed in the underground storage room on the west side. There are also some spare energy bars in the storage room. The space there is narrow. 9 capsules are activated. Although the replaced oxygen is not as much as the 24 capsules in normal operation outside, but in such a small and relatively closed environment, the concentration it will be higher. It's not a problem to hold off for a while. Not to mention. Chus glanced at the communicator that kept telling him not enough battery, and thought impatiently, although it won't be useful for the time being, it's always good to find a way to continue the battery. As an ordinary person, Mop has never been trained in extreme environments, and his tolerance to hypoxia is far inferior to Chus. His current brain is not much different from that of a goldfish, almost a move. When he heard that Truth had said there was a way, he stood up reflexively without thinking about it, put his arms around the small mop that had just reached his waist, and staggered behind him. Chus familiarly led him down a forest road in the dark. It only takes 8 minutes to walk along this road to the villa. Open the storage room and activate the spare frozen capsule. It takes at most 5 minutes, and there are still 10 minutes left for them to rest. Time is not too tight, so Truth's bad mood before is slightly better. However, within 5 minutes, when he was less than 50 meters away from the villa, Chus's lingering communicator suddenly dinged. Chus paused and glanced at the communicator almost in surprise. Vibration is a reminder that the battery is low. This short, light sound is not, it's a reminder of information. Because of the lack of power, the light on the screen was a bit dim, but it was still enough for him to see the above prompt. Sure enough, there is an update message. Chus frowned and opened his eyebrows, and glanced at the content of the message. It's surprising that my unforgiving executive didn't scold him back. My dear, I am a little bored without receiving your reply. Sae Young Truth. Which neuropathy would wait 27 years before saying why don't you reply to me? But this is not the most terrible thing. The most terrible thing is Sae Young is starting to get bored. Every time Sae Young gets bored, there are a bunch of security mansion officials who want to wipe his neck and hang himself. Truss' face went dark and quickly returned to normal. He laughed suddenly and typed a line on the communicator. It's really boring. I suggest you play with yourself or the unremovable controller on your arm for a while. This is very provocative. As we all know, all the humanoid self-propelled missiles in the space prison are all human-shaped self-propelled missiles, and none of them are easy to control. Although the entire prison system can hardly find any loopholes that can be drilled, it is inexhaustible, and it is simply shed far beyond the galaxy, but there is still no guarantee that those missiles will not have the opportunity to escape. So at the same time as they were in prison, each of them had a controller installed on their arms. It is 100 times more difficult to remove the controller than to get out of the space prison. As a result, when Truth finished typing this heartwarming sentence and was about to send it, the entire communicator screen flashed suddenly, completely blacking out. Out of battery. The message hasn't been replied yet. This unlucky thing just ran out of power at a critical time. Chus. He could smile just now, but he really couldn't laugh at this moment. The mop didn't understand his sudden pause, so I stared blankly at him, pulling the collar of his shirt a little irritably, and then abruptly accelerated his pace. He is tall and long in legs. Except for the cold sweat on his forehead, there is almost no hypoxia reaction. In just 3 or 2 steps, he threw out a large and small mop with weak feet. At you. The mop took a breath, and squeezed to catch up. Why are you so anxious all of a sudden, so anxious? Truth didn't answer, but walked faster. If it hadn't been for him to add your leg was sawn, Mop would have doubted that Truth was trying to dump them directly. The last 50 meters is not a long distance. With one person, Chu Si doubled the speed of the entire THRE Epperson team. When they stood in front of the front yard of the villa, they had a full 22 minutes remaining. But the Mop half-life is gone. He stuck out his tongue, slid down against the wall half-dead, staring at the door lock with cockfighting eyes, and said, God, I just remembered it, it's useless if it comes, this door, we can't open this door. I have to brush the iris. I had a long time ago. Forget it, anyway, I have to brush that sir's iris. The Mop cast a random look at Chus. You look so young, are you the guard here? It doesn't look like that, secretary. Hey, fuck it, we probably have to run again anyway, take your chief from the frozen capsule drag out before the word come was spoken. Truss was standing in front of the scanner blankly and pressed the switch. Fortunately, the energy system of this villa is as expected, and it can continue to operate for a while. The scanner made a beep, sweeping across Truth's iris. The door clicked and opened slowly. Mop, fuck. I don't have any problem with you standing here stupidly until you die, but please, don't jam the door and consume electricity. Chus raised his foot and strode forward along the straight path in the courtyard. The Mop remained in a state of being unable to close his mouth, reflexively stepped away, and dragged the small Mop to hurriedly follow. The door closed automatically behind them, an electronic lock sounded, and there was no more movement. But this yard is not quiet. There is always a very low buzzing noise in the yard, which is not annoying, but it never stops. The sound came from a metal cylinder in the corner. The column is about 1 person tall, and there is a circle of holes on the top, emitting a bright blue light, and there are countless extremely thin metal needles in the holes, exploding like a hedgehog. It may seem funny, but it can be called the greatest invention in the millennium on the planet. Although there is only a simple metal column on the ground, a huge material pool with complex design is connected to the ground. It can radiate a protective circle in the landslide, enveloping all objects in the range. It is precisely because of it that the planet was not completely destroyed in a sudden explosion, but fell apart into large and small fragments, scattered into space in a huge impact, just like this black cedar forest and this building. Like the villa, it has become a wanderer in the vast sea of stars. I don't know when it will end. That's the dragon pillar. The mop looked at the metal pillar with awe and awe. I have never seen it in the activated state. Perhaps the bright blue light was too alluring. When he said that, he couldn't help but stretched out his hand, subconsciously wanting to go there. Chu si tisk, talk about it, stop for a minute and don't die, hey. Before the mop got close to the dragon pillar, he felt a faint tearing force, and he was shocked to retreat 2 steps in a row, returning to Chus in a slanderous manner. The door lock of the villa is also the identity verification, which is no hindrance to Truss. After all, this is his house. He led 2 mops, one large and one small, to the underground storage room familiarly. In order to save energy, they took the stairs specially. The storage room is an amazingly airtight place. As soon as you enter it, you can smell a mixture of electronic instrument motherboards and metals. After all, it has been completely dust-sealed for 50 years. Truth turned on the smallest emergency light, barely enough for the 2 of them to see the outline of the indoor instrument. 9 freezer capsules neatly occupy most of the storage room. On the other 3 walls, there are 2 cabinets with various things on the other side, and one side is a console, which is connected to several large and small screens. I don't know if it is monitoring or what. How long can the electricity in this room last? Asked the mop. Come on, quickly turn on these charming frozen capsules, I'm going to die of suffocation. Perhaps seeing the hope of living, his tone could be regarded as brisk. As a result, Chus bypassed the capsule on the ground and went straight to one of the cabinets, searching for something in the top row. What? What else do you need to start it? The mop followed in confusion, and glanced at the watch again. Truss touched a metal cube in the 4th cabinet and said without lifting his eyelids, the capsule is not in a hurry. I will power on the communicator first. Communicator? The mop didn't respond, and blinked twice. What are you doing to recharge the communicator? The communicator is needed to start the capsule. Truth replied, no, reply to a message. Mop. With a plop, he knelt down to Truss. Can't you just talk to your death afterwards? Chus held the metal block against the back of the communicator and pressed the button on the metal block. With a ding sound, the communicator numbed his fingers, then the screen turned on and the phone was turned on again. Truth then glanced at the mop who was kneeling and crying, and picked up a thread from the ground and connected it to the jack on the wall. The intelligence system is turned on, the frozen capsule operation test is restarted, and the monitoring outside the forest detects that it was abnormally closed last time, and repositioning it for you. After positioning is complete, monitoring continues. The mop watched a series of electronic devices restart, and the 9 frozen capsules made a hum sound and finally started to operate. The capsules here are usually used for testing, which is different from the opening methods in the woods. Chus leaned on the side of the console, supporting the edge with one hand, and quickly touching the communicator screen with the other. Sae Young complained that the boring information was still lying on his receiving channel. 7 minutes had passed since now. This time, Chu Si didn't enter any provocative content. In order to save time, he didn't even type a word, and sent it directly after clicking a period. In any case, this is a reply anyway. The frozen capsule was opened, and oxygen gradually escaped from the air vents of the chassis. 2 mops, one large and one small, hugged each other, leaning against the capsule like a paralyzed body. Once normal operation, the hum of the machine disappeared, and the storage room gradually became quiet. The mop let out a long sigh, squinting at Chus. Finally, it's getting over. He felt so comfortable that he could sleep with the capsule in his arms. After a while, he remembered something and asked, "What information did you want to get back when you were in a hurry to recharge? We are all in space dust. Does someone have that leisurely sentiment to send you a message? Simply unreasonable." Chus raised his eyelids. "A terrorist. Mop, how scary. Are you so scary if you don't reply to the message?" Chu Si dropped the communicator on the console. "Of course not, he is also bombing the planet." Mop pulled out his ears. "It's not that you waited for me to hear something terrible. Are you kidding me?" Truth turned his head and looked at the large and small screens behind him, without speaking again. The mop stared at him in horror for a while, and felt that such an astonishing thing was impossible to say in this tone. He wondered for a moment, and then took in oxygen with confidence. It must be a joke. The screen on the electronic console is lit, and each piece corresponds to a place outside the villa and the cedar forest, rotating by itself at a certain frequency. However, as far as the current situation is concerned, the so-called surveillance is temporarily useless, because it is very likely that there are only 3 of them on this piece of debris. 2 of the areas monitored by the screen have reached the edge of the debris, and you can see the abrupt cliffs. Beyond the cliffs, there is endless space. Zingai is on top of his head and under his feet. This is actually a very peculiar view, but Chu Si watched it quietly for 2 seconds before moving his finger to the power button. Such a big monitor is always on, which is really a waste of energy. Just when Truth was about to press the power button, the intelligent system suddenly made a sound. Alarm! Someone broke into the second monitoring zone. Alarm! Someone broke into the second monitoring zone. The second monitoring area is not elsewhere, it is the abrupt cliff that connects the Sea of Stars, which is the boundary of this land. Mop was startled by the sound, turned over and sat up, leaning over. Truth frowned, his eyes fell on the screen, and he saw a figure turning up from the cliff, standing on a black rock accurately and neatly. He was tall and slender, and when he landed, his arms stretched beautifully. An oxygen mask on his face covered his face so tightly that he could only see his thin jawline when he turned his head. At a glance, the mop saw a black gold circle around the man's arm, and cried out, lying on the grass, "People in the space prison." The man stood on the black stone, turned his face and swept around, then suddenly stopped moving right at the screen. He shrugged and walked towards the screen with his foot raised. When he got to the nearest place, he raised his hand and lifted the mask off his face, revealing an extremely handsome face. The pupils of his eyes were very pale, and he had a strong arrogance when he squinted, but in a blink of an eye he was deluded by a smile at the corner of his mouth. The man wiped the camera with his thumb, smiled condescendingly, and said, "My dear, I can't get your reply, so I'm here to look for you. God said that this world does not always do what people want." On the first day he opened his eyes in the desert, he saw a ghost alive. Esther Neverland suddenly seeing the face that was close to the screen, Chu Si's pupils still tightened. The shirt sleeve was turned over twice by him, and the thin muscles on the exposed half of the forearm were visibly tightened and relaxed again in a blink of an eye. Although he dealt with emotions quickly and his complexion returned to normal in an instant, the mop next to him still noticed. He had only met Chus for less than half an hour, and there was absolutely no understanding. So I don't know if Chus's subconscious reaction is defensive or nervous, or something else. Anyway, it makes him even more panicked. He clearly caught the phrase "can't receive a reply," so he lowered his voice and asked Truth tremblingly, "This is the one you were talking about, the terrorist?" Truth did not answer. He stared at the screen without turning his eyes, as if staring at a lion walking up close, moved his finger to a red button, tapped it, and said lukewarmly, "I replied." "Mop, hey." He opened his mouth and froze for a moment, until he heard the overly handsome man on the screen laugh, and realized that Chu Si's words were not spoken to him, but passed to the other side of the screen. The man gave raised his eyebrows, and asked, "What did you get back?" He didn't seem to be too lazy to open his mouth when he spoke, his voice pressed down to the bottom of his throat, and it sounded low and somewhat casual. Perhaps the inherent impression of space prison was too demonized, or perhaps the previous description of truth was disturbing. This man is obviously not related to very wicked, and he speaks very ordinary things, but the mop just listens a little nervously. He squeezed his fingers unconsciously, turned his head and waited for truth to answer. Instinct told him that truth would never say anything that pleases the other party. "Forget it, quite a lot, I suggest to see it by myself when I receive it," Chus said without changing his face. "Mop. I don't know why, I always feel that this man is talking nonsense with his eyes open." Chuston paused, then added calmly, "But it seems that even the cosmic supersignal is going around you, maybe it will take another 27 years to receive it." As soon as he finished speaking, there was a clear ding on the other side of the screen. The man straightened up slightly, took out a communicator and glanced at it with his head. He was still on the edge of the screen with one hand, and swiped twice while holding the communicator in the other hand. He only glanced at it, then laughed, holding the communicator and shaking in front of the screen, a lot. Mop. Truth, who was exposed, didn't care at all, it contains a lot of meaning. Man, for example. Truth, for example, I wish you an early return to prison. Mop thought for a while, and silently retracted to the ground along the countertop. In this situation, he really didn't want to show his face, and he wanted to live a few more days. The two people at the front and back of the screen, one supporting the screen and the other supporting the console, are leaning forward, their eyes hanging slightly, their postures are casual and relaxed. It looks like a pair of old friends are reminiscing about the past. But this old-fashioned way of speaking makes the mop's face turn green when he hears it. However, after the mop was paralyzed under the countertop for a while, he felt a little strange again. He man didn't know how much effort to find it, dragged the monitor and chatted for a long time, but he didn't mean to approach the villa at all. He pondered for a moment, didn't figure it out, and couldn't help but glanced at the probe secretly. On the screen, the man has stood upright, while biting the tip of one black glove with his teeth, while unbuttoning the other glove. He tilted his head slightly, glanced down from the corner of his eye, looked down at the camera, and said vaguely, "Aren't you really looking at me?" Before I unscrewed the controller. Truth raised his eyebrows. "No." After speaking, he pressed the power button on the console. The monitoring system outside the forest turns off and enters the energy-saving mode. At the same time that the mechanical electronic sound was finished, the large and small screens on the wall went black at the same time, and the image disappeared. Closed. "That's it for you." Mop twitched his mouth, pointing to those screens, "Just throw him there." Chu Si easily picked up the communicator on the console and threw it into the pocket of his trousers as he said, "I just want to save electricity." "Mop, choose one of power transmission and death." "I will choose power transmission. It's a pity that the house belongs to me." While talking, Chus walked to the cabinet by the wall and opened the two cabinets in the lower right corner in a familiar way. The mop was still a little bit awkward. He touched his ankle silently, and said, "To be honest, I'm a little bit weak." "Did you really turn off him and ignore him? People who can blow up the planet without replying, it's really good to leave him alone." "Is it? I feel like we are looking for death." As if he hadn't heard of it, Chu Si picked it out in the cabinet for a while, turned over something, and placed it on a frozen capsule next to him. Mop was embarrassed to be in front of the owner, was too curious about these cabinets, just glanced inadvertently. What Chus uncovered was a box of silencer earplugs and a pair of gloves. He put on his gloves and took out a metal box from the corner. Judging from the size of the box, the weight is definitely not light, but it seems very light in his hand. "What's this?" The mop blinked. "It's an ancient one, it's useless in ordinary days. Truss touched the side of the lock with his thumb, and the box automatically opened with a click, revealing a row of silver utensils inside. Toolbox! Mop exclaimed, your toolbox is actually made like a high-precision instrument password box. It seems that it is not the same thing as the one I often use. Chuss moved for a while and glanced at him. What do you use often? The Mop gave an oh and scratched his head. I didn't even care about the mess just now. I'm an aircraft function maintenance technician. Truth nodded clearly, turned the box decisively, and pushed in front of the Mop. That would be great. The Mop was confused. What are you going to do? Chu Si lifted his chin at the frozen capsule next to him. Take the chassis apart. Ever since I met Chuss, Mop felt that he was bewildered more and more times. Why dismantle the chassis? What did it do wrong? Mop asked. Chuss bit the tip of one glove and took it off, then went to another glove, and explained lightly, each capsule has an air displacer embedded in the chassis, 3, just enough. The Mop glanced at him, and for a moment, he felt that Truth's movements were familiar, but before he had time to think about it, he was drawn away by Truth's thoughts. I've only disassembled the aircraft, I haven't touched this thing. If you can, you'd better. Before he finished speaking, Chuss interrupted him, I won't. Mop, then you drag out the toolbox. Try it whatever you want, in case it's dismantled. Truss replied calmly. Mop. He understood. The man in front of him is a master who talks nonsense, and he looks particularly bluffing. Fortunately, after being frozen for 47 years and wandering for another 3 years, his technology has not been completely abandoned. Although the frozen capsule is generally applicable to the intelligent system, it also leaves an entrance for manual maintenance in the corner. The overall peeling speed is actually very fast. After a few minutes of Mop, the doorway is cleared, and the chassis of the capsule is unloaded into 7 or 8 parts in a blink of an eye. The little Mop, who hadn't said a word from the beginning till now, sat quietly on the side, skillfully handing him tools, and staring at Chuss with sullen eyes from time to time. Truth seemed to feel relieved to hand the capsule to the Mop to toss. Instead of staring at the Mop, he took out a black cylinder bag in another cabinet he opened. Okay. The Mop made a sudden sound, spreading out his palms, and lying in the palms were 3 black boxes the size of pebbles with thin tubes attached to them. Thank you. Chu Si lifted one hand and hung the very compact replacement machine behind his ear very naturally. The curved thin tube just caught the ear bone and extended from the side of his face. The replacement machine was switched on, a slight buzzing sound rang in my ears, and I worked tirelessly on my face. Mop raised his face and watched him carry the heavy cylindrical bag, and then took out a pair of soundproof earplugs from the box set aside. What are you going to do? Mop looked blank. Chuss walked out the door without looking back. Go and appease the terrorist. Mop, then what are you carrying? A condolence. Chuss stepped out of the door, turned his head and smiled. R-72 rocket launcher. Mop. Do you use rocket launchers when you lie down in a big trough? Don't look at me with that expression. When you are in a good mood, you will switch to something else. When Chuss went out carrying the barrel, he was as relaxed as if he had just finished afternoon tea and was about to go out for a dog walk. Mop didn't believe him, for example. Polite missile. Chuss answered casually. The Mop couldn't help asking, is there any difference? Chuss raised his hand and pressed a switch outside the storage room door, and replied, the bullet rails are more elegant, they look gentler. Mop, are you really describing the paw egg that can blast the entire cedar forest into dregs? Okay. Mop gave himself a mouth, believe in your evil. I'm a fool to take this ancestor's nonsense again. He had planned well. Chu Si must go to provoke the desperado. He didn't stop him, he didn't want to die anyway. However, as soon as he retracted to the side of the capsule, he heard an unwavering mechanical and electronic sound from the entire storage room. The lock system in the room is turned on, and the trigger self-destruct device is activated. The countdown is 10 seconds, 10. What is this again? Mop was surprised. Truth's voice followed his footsteps further and further. I am more suspicious, so I don't worry about keeping strangers watching the house. Don't worry, if you pay attention, the room won't explode. Akarp hit the mop and stood up, grabbed the thin little mop and ran to the door, not forgetting to bring the box with soundproof earplugs. No, 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 no. Watch the door. One big and one small can be squeezed out, and the door behind him has been automatically locked. The mop had a green face and 3 steps and made 2 steps up the stairs. When he chased to the door of the villa, Chus was taking out a pair of glasses from the closet drawer by the door. You too. Chus buckled the protective lens and walked along the stairs outside the door to the 3rd floor terrace. The whole process was not hurried or slow, and it seemed that he didn't worry about the terrorist rioting with discontent. The mop buckled himself and the small mop on the air displacement machine, and his face collapsed like a concubine. Go, if you don't go, what if you blow me up unhappy? Sorry, I just don't like watching people collapse, especially when I have to get up to do something. Truth stood on the edge of the roof, and while removing the black outer bag of the rocket launcher, he answered lightly. This person is an out-and-out bastard. Whenever he talks about all kinds of threats, he will add some decorations such as sorry, excuse me, I'm sorry, and I'm sorry. Sometimes he smiled a little, as if he really felt it was inappropriate to threaten people. In the past, the old guys in the building were always vomiting blood with anger, and they jumped in the conference room. So much so that his deputy Carl couldn't stand it anymore, and occasionally couldn't help but ask the last sentence, did they ever wear shoes for you? Truth would always reply, who knows, don't you think their eyes are always a little guilty? Don't you have done something bad without telling me? His tone has always been half truth and half false, making it difficult to understand whether he was joking or being true, so after hearing this answer several times, Carl consciously stopped asking. Okay, well, you have the final say from now on. The mop was startled by him, and he was loyal to a face that had eaten rat medicine. From their perspective, they saw a neat black figure standing in the corner between the cedar forest and the edge of the earth at a distance of 50 or 60 meters from the courtyard wall of the villa, and there was a pile of stacks of unknown origin at his feet. Other than that, it was empty. Hey! My tent! The mop subconsciously pointed at the pile of objects and cried out. After speaking, he remembered that there was an escaped prisoner standing where he was pointing. So he shut his mouth suddenly, silently retracted his finger, grabbed the small mop and squatted down, blocking his face. Truth said regretfully, you probably have to say goodbye to your tent. His voice is not loud, but the black figure's ears are very good. After catching the familiar voice, he raised his head and locked his eyes accurately on Chus. My dear commander, you finally can't help coming out. He stepped on the slightly raised surveillance camera on the ground, his knees bent slightly, but his legs were longer. He raised his head, showing a boring gesture, with a little smile in his voice, but he couldn't see what it meant. Sae Young, long time no see. Chus even raised his left hand at him, as if he was really saying hello. It's been a long time. I would be happier if I could give my surname when calling me. Sae squinted at him, seeming to be looking seriously at something. After a while, he suddenly smiled and said, by the way, I miss you very much. Mop. It stands to reason that the chief of the government and the fugitive from the space prison are also hostile, right? Why did this fugitive open his mouth dear and shut his mouth miss you very much? Is this intentional? It should be intentional, right? Mop suddenly became a little uneasy, and glanced at Chus secretly, but his perspective was clear, he could only see Chus's chin, and he couldn't see his expression. Truth seems to have been accustomed to Sae's way of speaking, and adapts well. Not only did he not disagree with the phrase "I miss you so much," he even replied to the other party in a good voice. He said, "If you are squatting in jail, I can probably try to think of you." The mop immediately slipped and almost fell from the edge of the roof. "Mom, help!" Sahi seemed to be very accustomed to such an answer, and he didn't care. He shrugged, swept the surroundings, and asked Truth solemnly, "Don't you feel boring in such a big place? You are the only one? My dear, how about giving me a corner? Mop? Can't you see a living person here?" Truth shrugged, "Sorry, I don't find it boring. Sir, then for another reason, Space Super Signal doesn't like me too much and prevents me from sending you messages." Truth, "Thank God, it just happened to be able to pay me peace." Sir smiled, "Change another one, I like this villa very much." Truth also laughed, "I advise you not to covet other people's real estate casually." Sir finally stopped talking about it. He opened his arms lazily, "I am penniless, homeless, clinking poor, and starving to death." As he said, he suddenly licked his slightly chapped lower lip, and added, "The one squatting next to you looks fat and thin. If you have another handful of seasoning. Mop is like a morning concubine. Oh hi, you saw me again now." He hurriedly turned his head and asked Chus, "Is he kidding?" Truth glanced at him and said, "I'm not sure." The mop turned his head and was about to run downstairs for his life, but Chus held it back. "I think he seems to be sick," Mop said with a stiff neck. Truth took it for granted, otherwise, how could he be in the space prison? It was strange that there would still be wind on the fragments that were held by the protective cover of the dragon pillar. For a while, he swept behind them, and the goosebumps on the back of the mop were all over. The bushes in the backyard of the villa were rustled by the wind, but Chus and the others did not notice. After all, there is a neurosis in front of him, who would dare to distract attention elsewhere? "My dear, how are you thinking about it?" Sir asked, as if he was really very reasonable. Chu Stanran said, "Since you expose your scars like this, wouldn't it be too cruel for me to refuse you any more?" Sahi hung his fingers on the side of the oxygen supply mask and hung loosely on his side. Whenever Chus speaks, he will show great patience. At that moment, he looks like a beast that has just been hunted. He is lazy, and even gives people a kind of not that dangerous illusion. Chus did not change his face and said, "To be honest, I have prepared a present for you." Sahi raised some interest and stood up straight. "Gift? What gift?" The mop squatting on the ground groaned and silently covered his eyes. Sir smiled and took a step back, opened his arms, his lazy tone remained the same, "Come on, I close my eyes." With the right hand, Chus mounted the carefully prepared R-72 rocket launcher on the exquisite railings on the edge of the platform, aimed neatly and fired. The cannonball rushed forward like wild dogs, blowing up the ceiling. That piece of land was already on the edge, very thin, and when it was bombarded by a rocket launcher, it broke apart immediately. The abandoned tent together with the mop, about 10 square meters of land, broke directly from the debris of the planet. "As you wish, I have given you a part, no thanks," Chu Si said. Sir stood on such a broken ground, and became a big head whale in an isolated island. However, before Chus had time to unload the rocket launcher, he angered him again, and the sound of the sky and the earth exploded. The whole planet shattered suddenly, and the mops knelt directly on the ground. The mop guarded the kid in his arms in horror amidst the shaking of the ground, and exclaimed, "Did you shoot another shot? Are you sure you didn't reverse the direction?" Truth suddenly dragged him to the edge of the platform, "It's not me." After speaking, he kicked the two men off the platform and jumped off himself. "Who else? This is the third floor." It was said that it was on the third floor, and it was only a moment of landing. Something was thrown from the air in the chaos, with a tingling and tearing sensation as if it was static or something else, as if being slapped in a whip. When his back touched the ground, Chus subconsciously protected his head. But the violent impact that was difficult to offset still made his mind shake, and there was an instant blank. "I caught you!" A voice suddenly hit his ears. "Who?" Chu Si rolled on his side by inertia, half kneeling on the ground, his eyes quickly swept around. They landed in the front yard, and besides him, there was no one else besides the mop that was crawling around. "Who? What happened to the explosion just now? I seem to have been hit by something." The mop almost threw himself to the corner of the courtyard, against the wall behind his back, tightly hugging the small mop, and shrank in the shadows. "Someone said something to me just now." Chus also dashed to the wall. "Me? I've been screaming." The mop replied, sweeping his eyes suspiciously. Truth frowned. "It's not you." The voice seemed vague in the chaos, but it should be a young man, who had never heard it before, and was inexplicably familiar. Before he could think about it, the whirring wind came from the sky again. "God!" The mop lifted his face dumbfounded. Seeing 3 huge silver grabbing ropes flicking from above, the grabbing ropes ran through every inch of the air, making a slight crackling sound, making people feel chilly. But in a blink of an eye, the mop reacted. The chills were not simply because of panic and fear, but because of static electricity. They watched as the grasping rope crashed to the ground, shaking unceasingly with the entire planet fragments, so much that they couldn't sit still at all, and they almost became on the disc. The grabbing line accurately rolled down the edge of the debris and went under the chassis. The pointed end of the metal grabbing rope hooked on the rocks and cliffs, and the sound of the impact was harsh. The fragments of the entire planet were held firmly by these 3 grasping ropes. The mop was slammed against the wall several times in the irresistible vibration, and shouted, "What is this thing?" There was too much noise, he had to growl to make Chus hear it. "Is that the terrorist named Yang finally can't stand your riot?" "Shut up!" Truth said. As soon as the voice fell, a huge silver object slowly emerged from the starry sky. It is made up of several oblate circles of different sizes. At first glance, it looks like several steel spiders gathered in groups. And the 3 grabbing ropes were hanging down from the iron spider. The moment it appeared, Truss' face changed. "Space prison." "Mop, what? What are we doing in the space prison bombing?" This guy, who was a circle bigger than the entire Black Cedar Forest, was nothing else. It was the space prison used to exile dangerous elements, where Su Yung should have stayed. People on the entire planet know the space prison and know what it means, but I am afraid that no one has looked up at it from such a perspective under such circumstances. Who could have imagined that the Devil concentration camp would one day float on top of his head? But Truth knew too much about this behemoth. Those 3 grabbing lines don't look sturdy, but they are surprisingly strong. After all, the discs that make up the space prison are connected by this material. They have been dragged between the stars for hundreds of years, and the wear rate is less than that. 17%. Such a thing, wanting to withstand this fragment of the planet, is simply a piece of cake. Moreover, the claws on the top of the grabbing cable are hollow, and the inner structure is sophisticated and complex, which can construct a powerful energy field at the moment of successfully grabbing the target. A trembling sound came from the bottom of the planet debris. An energy field with a huge repulsive force has already taken shape. With an irresistible aura, coordinated with the pulling of the grasping cable, the debris is pushed upward. At that moment, Chu Si and the others were extremely uncomfortable. Under the influence of the huge shock, the courtyard wall that had been abandoned for 50 years finally collapsed into piles. The scattered dust did not spread, nor did it fall to the ground, but rushed upward. The ruins of the wall creaked and trembled. "I feel terrible. Like being dragged into the sky by my hair." The mop shouted loudly, "Can we still run away?" "I'm afraid not." Truth said this, but didn't mean to sit still. He let the smoke pass, frowned, and coughed, hurriedly looking around in the chaos. "Correct. There is also the corner assigned to SAE. Here." Chu Si shouted at the mop. and jumped directly over the collapsed wall, toward the edge. At that moment, it was so rushed that he could hardly figure out how many times he pushed the mop and was pulled several times by others. He didn't even see who was pulling him, he even leaped over the crack and landed on another piece of ground. "Lend me your bazooka," a deep voice rang in my ears. However, before the other party could finish speaking, Chu Si had already reflexively set up his R-72, "Shut up." He reacted after cursing and said that the person who was going to borrow the rocket was Sae Young. It was just that at that moment, his hands were faster than his brain, and the moment he reacted, the muzzle had already swept in one direction. The latest model of the R-72 rocket launcher has amazing bombardment effects and has a material separation effect. The most expensive one can fire 10 rounds in a row. Boom boom boom, the sound of the explosion was earth-shaking. One after another, all 9 shots came out in a blink of an eye. The mop that fell on the ground hadn't recovered yet, it was bombarded with the shaking of the mountain, and it rained like rain. He suspected that Truth hadn't even had the time to aim in that short period of time. However, the artillery fire exploded into a standard dotted line, and the planet fragments fell apart again along the dotted line. The dotted line is a whole piece of ground hooked up by the grab rope of the space prison, with a large black cedar forest, and the villa they just stayed in. The dotted line is the dragon pillar still in blue light. The fragments of the land with the dragon pillars escaped from the grasp and fell back down. In the process, they hit the corner where they were standing, and they were barely pieced together into larger fragments. But it is only big in a relative sense. Round off the front and back, and the visual inspection does not exceed 40 square meters. And these few of them, standing or paralyzed, stood silently on this piece of debris, stunned into a group of big-head whales on the isolated island. Chus carried the empty rocket launcher, looked up at the ground captured by the space prison, and said blankly, "My house and my men." After speaking, he lowered his eyes and swept around. "What a great place! There is the chief of the security building himself, the terrorist Sae Young, and a pair of mops that buy one, get one free, and he mime, and it's so fun." Chief Chu, who lost his real estate and lost people, was not happy at all. He turned his gaze and stared at Sae Young, pointing his finger at the space prison that suddenly struck above, and said, "Are you supposed to explain explanation?" Sae raised his head, pushed his cheek with the tip of his tongue, and squinted at the underside of the behemoth. After a while, he looked at the opposite truss, raised his hand lazily and touched his brow bone, and offered a salute to how rascal he was. He dragged his tone and said, "Report, sir, the space prison seems to be under your control, are you sleepy?" "Truth. Fart you." Of course he was not sleepy. It is precisely because the space prison is supposed to be managed by him, that he can instantly perceive the problem. Sae Young ran out, the prison should be full of the universe to hunt him. The controller in his hand has not been destroyed yet, and the space prison can accurately locate the position to the centimeter level, and even within the radiation range of the controller, directly put him into physiological shock. But now, the space prison leapt over, and the grabbing line it dropped didn't actually go to Sae. Under normal circumstances, such an error is enough to make the prison management collectively resign. What's more problematic is that Truth's communicator has not been shut down, and his channel is still at the top of the prison's certification list. At the time of the attack, his location was on the star map screen of the prison, with an extremely conspicuous red mark. No matter how blind those managers were, they couldn't let the grasping rope call at their immediate superiors. That duo rushed to rebellion. With these weird combinations, Truss had to suspect that Sae was playing a ghost. "Don't stare at me with such pretty eyes, dear." He raised his hands. "I really can't explain it. If one day I am shot in the forehead, I might choose to believe you once." Truss replied with a slight bluntness. Sae laughed, "We have known each other long enough to raise a short-legged kid to adulthood. I am sad that you are so unrelenting." "You are sad?" Truth opened his mouth and replied, Even if I grow up to raise the cub into ashes, I will still be like this. Mop. What the is this metaphor? Friendly reminder, if you have time to be mean to me, why don't you take a look at your house and your subordinates? Ser still maintained the posture with his hands raised. Surrendering is full of surrender, after all, when you have a chance to see again they are probably 50 years from now. The silver-white space prison had already received the whole piece of debris from a very high altitude, and the spider belly of the chassis had opened a mouth, watching to swallow it in. The outer shell of the prison flashed a circle of blue light, and the ripples generally passed from the beginning to the end. That means the transition had begun. This is definitely not something that can be stopped with the power of 3 or 2 people. Truth couldn't figure out the purpose of this trip to the space prison for a while, but he was barely comforting. No matter who is in control of the prison now and what they are planning, his subordinates will not be in great danger for the time being. After all, a frozen capsule is not a waste for anyone, even if it is in use, even if it is difficult to open the capsule from the outside. But the house. Truss' face instantly collapsed. When he left the storage room, he turned on the self-destructing device. The advantage is that there is no need to worry about being pried. The downside is, not far from the bombing. Sure enough, in the process of reclosing the opening of the spider belly, a loud noise suddenly sounded. Even SAE looked over in a bit of surprise, and saw the entire space prison with blue wave in preparation for the jump, shivering suddenly, with black smoke billowing in his stomach, and a somewhat awkward look of fart billowing. SAER suddenly smiled and bends his eyes, leisurely gloating, reporting, "Sir, I like your character of breaking one's hand and taking off someone else's thigh." I don't know if the bomb touched some device, and the grabbing cord that the space prison had collected suddenly dropped again. The powerful energy field was a little chaotic and sizzling. The outer circle of hidden matter formed by the dragon pillar has an irresistible gravitational force on the thing. In the blink of an eye, the grasping rope is sucked in, as if there is an invisible big hand, pulling the grasping rope until it reaches the top of everyone's heads. Even Truth's scalp went numb, and he immediately moved away. Even though he reacted swiftly, a little blood still oozes from his forehead. The energy field was partially offset by the outer layer of hidden matter, and the rest was still enough to hurt people. But when Chus wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, the swaying grasping cord was suddenly caught by a hand. With bare hands, grabbed. The hand holding it was long and thin, but the bulging bones and joints showed inescapable strength. That is Ser's hand. Chu Si looked at it in surprise from the headache under the interference of the energy field, and the first reaction was not deserve it, but it's a pity. When the beautiful hand touched the metal surface of the grasping rope, it made a crackling sound, like water dripping into the boiling oil pan. Just listening to it, it felt that the skin was open and fleshy, and the pain was shocking. However, he just hissed very perfunctorily. With a flick of his wrist, he slammed the grabbing rope he was holding onto the dragon pillar as high as a person on the ground, and shook his hand again, saying, "My dear sir has divided me into such a vast land. I should always give a gift." This hooligan thing also added an accent to the word broad, for fear that others would not be able to hear him being sarcastic. The flexible metal of the grabbing rope was thrown around the dragon column for a few times, and then it was sucked tightly by the positive energy field released by the dragon column instantly, as if a knot was buckled. The attributes of the entire grasping rope were assimilated by the dragon pillar, and from bottom to top, it was transmitted to the end of the space prison in the blink of an eye. At this time, more than half of the space prison has successfully made the leap and disappeared in the star sea. It is impossible to stop abruptly because of this change, otherwise it will be immediately cut in half, crushed to pieces in time and space, and disappear in an instant. Boom boom boom, a burst of artillery fired from the disc at the front end. The lead shaft between the two small discs was bombarded into in the blink of an eye. The moment the connection was disconnected, the entire space prison made a successful leap and disappeared. Only the last disc held by the grasping cord is left. Ser put his fleshy hand upright and mumbled, "It's quite exciting." After speaking, he tilted his head and smiled at Chus, pointing to the grabbing rope and the space prison disc tied above him. My dear, I will send you a kite. Chus. Mob. God kite. The shocking artillery fire is the hymn of the devil. He grabbed a city in the sea of stars as a flower for God, and God asked him, Are you drinking too much? Esther Neverland Truth frowned a little, and glanced at the hapless kite, and suddenly felt a little headache. That thing was tied to the dragon pillar, because its energy field was assimilated by the dragon pillar, and under the action of the attraction, it was pulled closer from far away. Not to mention, it's a bit like a kite winding. Truth's head hurt even more. The planet fragments have changed abruptly from large to small, and their size and quality have been greatly changed. The quasi-gravity system and the rotation and rotation balance system of the dragon pillar are originally in the process of self-adjustment and adaptation. Suddenly, Sae Young, who owed his hand, tied an accessory to it, and immediately brought it into a new round of chaos and self-regulation. Truth could obviously feel that he had lost ground under his feet, and his sense of weightlessness was flickering. At the same time, the rotation of the entire fragment has become obvious, within the range that ordinary humans can physically perceive. It's like you are standing on a turntable and someone is holding your heart, shivering up and down. This taste is too disgusting. When the Dragon Column system was still in the R&D and debugging stage, Chu Si, as one of the chief officials in charge, participated in many simulation experiments, including the temporary imbalance of the pseudo-gravity system and the revolution and rotation balance system. This state of dizziness and panic is not unfamiliar, and it can barely be tolerated. But those two mops, big and small, won't work, and she looks dizzy. No, let me go, I'm going to throw up. The mop retched and lay on the ground. I think my face must be ugly, I'm going to die. The skeleton on the side of Chus's face moved slightly, as if gritted his teeth, suppressing the dizziness, and then replied, Your old dirt can reach about 3 layers of skin. X-rays can't see through. I can see your face. This bastard's mean mouth probably doesn't ask about life or death, regardless of the occasion, even in such a situation that he is about to vomit when he opens his mouth, he still doesn't forget to block people. As soon as he finished saying this, he heard a short low laugh next to him. To be honest, the voice is very nice, but coming from Ser's throat, it is inexplicably reminiscent of not-so-simple emotions such as sarcasm and meaningful. My dear, I really like your spirit more and more. Sahi said. When dizzy, closing your eyes can appropriately alleviate a little nausea. So when Chu Si heard this, he didn't open his eyes, but rubbed his temples with his fingers, and said coldly and warmly, Oh, I'm afraid you will see more in the future. He was silent for a while, but he still felt a little unhappy after thinking about it. Although he couldn't see Sae's appearance, listening to Sae's tone and voice alone, the other party didn't seem to feel uncomfortable because of this weightlessness and rotation. The cautious Chief Chu Wu felt unbalanced for a moment, and finally couldn't help raising his eyelid to take a look at Sae. Sure enough, I saw him standing steadily next to Long Zhu with his hands in his pockets, looking at Long Zhu from a barely safe distance. You didn't vomit. Truth said, closing his eyes again, suppressing the new wave of nausea. You still remember the little things that happened so many years ago. I'm really flattered. Sahi replied. But when you ask this, it would be better if you have less regret. Truth made no secret of regret. After 9 years in the space prison, are you used to this feeling? Thanks to you. Ser's voice was still a few meters away from him before, and suddenly he was close in front of him. It seems to be face to face with him. Chu Si suddenly opened his eyes, and saw that Ser's face was close at hand, leaning forward slightly to look at him like studying a dragon column, his nose almost touching the tip of his nose. Before he could react, Sahi suddenly breathed into his left eye. Truth's eyelids trembled, frowning and tilting his face back. But the prison can't exercise this. Ser smiled and stood up straight, and walked back 2 steps. If you try to stay on the edge of the black hole capture range for a few days, you will find that this degree of dizziness is simply not it's worth mentioning. Black hole. Truth didn't react for a moment. How come you were almost caught by a black hole? Sayre tilted his head and blinked his right eye. Guess. Chus. Guess your grandpa. This kind of behavior is always unpredictable neuropathy, and Truth has encountered such one from beginning to end. But this one has known him for a long time, so long that he almost occupied 3/4 of his life. Two people who have known each other for so many years, the relationship is mixed like this, it has to be said that it is quite a failure. In the year Sayre first entered the space prison, Truss thought about it once or twice. What kind of scene would it be like if the two face each other again? But it was just boring thinking about it. There will never be a prison or even a high-level leader of the government who would like to see the two of them living in the same room. That would probably be the disaster and the end of the entire building. But then he never thought about this issue again. After all, S.A. Young's imprisonment period was staggering, and the trial book clearly stated until the end of the planet's life. One summer, S.A. Young forcibly broke into the communication channel of his office and left him a few messages, asking him, "If we meet again, will you greet me with a smile or give me a shot?" At that time, Chu Si calmly replied, "There is no such day." In the end, God seemed to have made up his mind to see that Chus was not pleasing to his eyes. The planet exploded just 2 years after he left these words. And after the planet exploded for only 50 years, they met again. God is probably sick too, and he doesn't want to live his life well. The Dragon Pillar system's self-adjustment was so long and shocking that at the end the mop almost cried and asked Truth, "This is something that's not over yet, or I'll take the air displacer off, it's over." Although Truth has experienced various mimicry experiments, the experiments cannot be compared with reality after all. The time of the experiment is set, and reality does not say hello. Fortunately, no matter how long it is, there is an end to it. After the mop pushed it over and woke up for 3 full rounds, Long Zhu finally stabilized. The pseudo-gravity system is adjusted to the most suitable state, and the revolution and rotation balance system is also running freely. The outer hidden matter rotates quietly at a stable speed. With the buffer of the middle layer, the speed of the debris of the inner planet is lower than that of ordinary people's physiological perception. Below the critical line. For Truth and the others, it was finally down to earth, no longer dizzy and nauseous. But this unlucky kite is 2 laps larger than this piece of land. Is it really not overturned if it is so tucked on one side? Mop couldn't help but say. If it weren't for the 2 goddesses Chus and S.A. Young standing beside him, the mop would have thrown up on the floor, but they both glanced at him from time to time, and his bladder was swollen. He opened his mouth countless times, but he didn't dare to spit it out. Now he can only collapse on the ground, running down his chest one by one. Since he woke up, it seems that 80% of the time is in this position. He couldn't stand up anyway, he simply broke the jar, and under the gaze of the 2 door gods, he bit his scalp and stretched out his fingers to the side behemoth. The disc caught by Sayre's hand was mistakenly recognized as part of the planet fragment by the Dragon Pillar, and unreasonably dragged people into the protection circle, like dragging a dog to death. When the space prison was built, the technology used was to imitate heavy mecha technology, so the space prison itself had a certain degree of intelligence. If a complete space prison is pulled to test the intelligence level, it can almost be equivalent to a teenager who is about to mature. The space prison with his thighs removed is about the equivalent of a sick teenager. And the disc that was dragged in by the Dragon Pillar was the thigh from the space prison, which was equivalent to a mentally retarded teenager. Under the effect of the energy field of the Dragon Column, the mentally handicapped teenager was knocked on the edge of the earth and his face was bruised and swollen. Angrily, he stuck out a toe, an emergency interface with a port like a clip. Under normal circumstances, this emergency interface is used to interface with aircraft or mechas that temporarily visit the space prison, but the mentally retarded disk cannot make intelligent judgments and mistake the planetary debris for another aircraft. Hearing a few soft clicks, the emergency interface opened its mouth, barking a bit of dog teeth, biting the edge of the land, and forcibly connecting with the planet debris. A nondescript thing was born. Chus slumped his face, stared at the disk for a long time, and finally walked towards it with his foot raised. Tofivi Chief Chu, what do you want to do with the kite I sent you? Saer lazily said to his back, and raised his heel. You still have the face to say? Trus turned his head and glanced at him, and said blankly, how can I be Tofivi in this proportion? Since your eyes are so blind, I sincerely suggest that you still stay on the side and I will go in and see if I can search something useful. Saer didn't take his meanness seriously, and continued to follow leisurely. Chief Chu, who has very long legs, if he can find a lot of useful things, can you give me a credit? Chus. Why aren't you going away? When the two door gods were standing next to them, the mop felt that his hands and feet could not be released, and he was even cautious about dizziness and nausea, for fear of offending them, especially Sae Young. But seeing them put him down and walk to the door of the disc, he felt a little lost. The mop endures it for a while, not holding it back, staggering and holding the small mop to chase the two of them. Hearing the panicked footsteps, Chu Si raised his eyebrows and turned back. Is there a ghost chasing you? It's only 6 or 7 meters in total, so in such a hurry. Of course there are no real ghosts, but the whole fragment has only a light source like the dragon pillar, and the emitted light is dark blue fluorescence. No matter how good-looking people are against it, they will look ghostly. Even staring at the face of the little mop for more than 5 seconds made him feel a little scared. But it doesn't matter if you tell others about this kind of thing. If you tell someone like truth, it's just being brought to his mouth for being mean, so the mop stubbornly lifted his chin and said, nothing, I just want to say part of this space prison can be regarded as a kind of intelligent aircraft in a broad sense, in my professional category. The doors of this aircraft are very particular about opening, especially before he could finish speaking. Truth expertly pressed a button by the door again. The two metal covers slid open automatically, revealing the scanner hidden inside. It's just a little troublesome this time, not just iris scan. The red light scanned Chu Si from beginning to end, and a skeleton pattern and DNA sequence were quickly constructed on the screen. After a string of values was skipped quickly, 2 lines of words popped up on the screen, Certified Qualified Permissions MOP, when I didn't say it. Thank you for your kindness, but this happens to be within my authority. Truth shrugged. The mop was frustrated, and said that since he was not used for serious purposes for the time being, he could only be a mop bottle honestly. What will be here? Will there be food? God knows, I'm hungry. I just want to eat people. Sae Young suddenly turned his head and smiled at him. It's a coincidence, me too. The mop gave a pee silently. Although this big guy is handsome with a smile, it is more scary than a straight face. Even though the intelligent system of this disc is a bit mentally retarded, it is part of the space prison anyway. The door here has more layers than any other door, and the process of opening the door is much more complicated. The metal is humming, and the talking room has opened 2 floors. Saer was very confident about the things he had recovered. He put one hand in his pocket, and the other pointed at the metal door that was opening the 3rd floor. He said, Chief Chu, with high authority, we'll be able to see a meal soon. Taiwan's fresh food, fine wine, and even cigars, shouldn't you thank me? He naturally has a basis for saying this. Truth could draw the entire design of the space prison with his eyes closed. The situation was chaotic before, and he still couldn't react to it. Now he calmed down, and he remembered the correspondence between the disc and the design drawing in his mind. In this disc, on the east is a row of special confinement rooms, on the outside is the number 2 monitoring center, and on the west is the prison guard duty room and number 4 bunker. These are not important to Chus at this time. The most important thing is that in the middle of the disc is a restaurant. Restaurant, what a wonderful word. For now, it is not an exaggeration to say that it is heaven. From the moment he stepped out of the frozen capsule, Chu Si was so hungry that he wanted to eat people. No matter how big or small a mop he can't put down his mouth, Sae Young is afraid of indigestion. At this moment, he said that he wanted to search for something that could be used, but it was all nonsense. It is important to fill in the stomach first. The 5-story metal door was finally fully opened. Unsurprisingly, they would see the corridors of the prison guard duty room, and perhaps there were still confusing prison guards who could not figure out the situation. However, according to normal procedures, they should have all evacuated urgently before breaking the disc. However, after Chus raised his foot and stepped into the door, he frowned tightly. His position requires dealing with all kinds of dangers all year round, and he is extremely sensitive to some things. There is something wrong with this corridor. The doors of the 8 prison guard lounges in a row were all tightly closed, and even the small windows above were tightly closed. Truth's eyes swept across the door one by one, but his steps didn't stop. He tried to hold one of the door handles smoothly, and vaguely heard the electronic sound with a lower pitch. This is the response only when the smart system is locked. Why is it so dark? I thought it would be brightly lit. Isn't it in use before this space was blasted down? The mop's voice was full of confusion, and his voice was a little tight. Sae Young followed behind Chus, seemingly interested in the place where the prison guards lived, and looked up and down every door. They are all locked? It's a shame. I'm planning to borrow a lounge. It's a bath. In this environment, Chus's attention will always tighten unknowingly, catching every small movement around him, except that he will ignore the voice. Especially if Sae Young's nourishment is not particularly owed, it is directly filtered. The 8 prison guard lounges soon fell behind, and the leading Truth walked to the end of the corridor. As long as he turned the corner and passed through a partition door, he could see the dining room. Truth was not busy opening the door. He stood at the top of the corridor and looked around. What are we going to do now? Mop asked when he saw that Chus was not moving. Chu Si said, eat. The mop was taken aback, but it's a bit weird here, don't you need to check it out first to make sure it's safe? Chus's gaze retracted from the passages behind him, eat first. Mop. Well, I can see that you are too hungry. In fact, when he was speaking, Truss had already seen several places behind him that might hide people. They were all empty, at least there would be no immediate threats. Except for the inability to stop the danger of heads will be blasted by artillery in the next second, nothing can stop our Chief Chu from eating. Sae Yang finished lazily, tilting his upper body and crossing his arms over Chus. He pushed the door to the dining room open for him, right, dear? The door was not locked, it opened as soon as it was pushed. It slammed into the wall, and the noise made people startled. Just listen to the sound of ding-ling-ding-kang sounded at the same time. It was like when the old wooden box was pushed open, the dust that was suddenly lifted up was messy and disturbed. The restaurant that Chu Si imagined in his mind should be empty. The tables and chairs may have been skewed and messy during the emergency evacuation, and there may be slippers dropped by a frizzy idiot on the ground. But the self-pick-up food on the wall behind the bar should be intact. Well, maybe a few plates will be knocked to the ground. But in any case, it will never look like this. The dining tables and chairs were huddled and piled on top of each other, leaning against the wall, leaving a large piece of land in the middle, full of cages, and in each cage there was a dead dog paralyzed. They have black gold rings around their arms, grey-headed faces, and messy hair snarling out of the cage, just like fried chickens. It can be seen from the appearance that they have been kept in the cage for a long time. Suddenly seeing the door opened, they cheated the corpse in an instant, and desperately knocked on the smart telescopic metal on the cage with their shackles and shackles. Sae Young sniffed, I don't know when the restaurant was changed to a chicken farm. There are a lot of ingredients, but it's a bit rotten. The people in the cage were taken aback for a moment. After hearing his words, they became more excited, and the cage shook the sky. Chu Si first selectively ignored these cages that shouldn't be here, but glanced at the rack behind the bar where the food should have been placed. As a result, the above was empty, not to mention fresh food, there was no root grass or leaves. Chief Chu, who was extremely hungry, was so dark in front of him that he was in a bad mood. He frowned, his face darkened, and he had to regain his gaze on those cages, and said, "There are two questions." He raised his eyebrows, say. Truth, first, what happened when you escaped from prison, how did the space prison become such a ghost? Second, how do we divide these, rotten meat? 5 to 5. The clanging in the cage stopped abruptly, and the rotten meat fell into deathly silence. Mob. Sir, you don't look like a sir at all now, do you know that you are a terrorist number 2? When Chus asked this, he didn't look at Sir, but raised his foot and walked to the nearest cage. When he was only half a meter away from the cage, he frowned and gave in, probably because the prisoner's nasty smell rushed his head. Tisk, excuse me, how long does it take for you to ferment this flavor? The prisoner. Anyone who can be sent to a space prison can be listed on the government's key defense list if you pick one out. In a sense, they can be regarded as a famous person in this field. Don't say scare the crying child, give a name. It is not a problem to scare an adult. Even if they are locked in a cage at the moment, it is even a bit funny to describe the embarrassment, but in the eyes of ordinary people, they are still wolves that may counterattack at any time. Walking around the cage like a mop, leaving it far to one side, is the response of ordinary people. The prisoner in the cage probably encountered truth's door todo or provocation for the first time, and he was so damaged that he couldn't speak for a while, staring blankly there. The mob shrank in the corner and couldn't help but interject, if I remember correctly, you said when you pointed your gun at me, if you can't find meat that is cleaner than me, you would rather starve to death. Now you don't pay attention to it. Truth turned his head to look at him, you seem to be sorry. Mob, no. No. You go on, I shut up. He said, raising his hand and making a cross in front of his mouth. Sarah looked around, there is water and electricity here, so I can wash it up 7 or 8 times, but I can barely eat it. Prisoner. He struggled abruptly, slammed his fist against the cage, and opened his mouth to curse something. Judging from the violent veins on the side of her neck, Hwa's strength is not small. But even Truth, who was close at hand, couldn't hear half a word. The prisoner cursed silently, then stared at Truss, and said a word. Still used a lot, but there is still no sound. Chu Si loosely clenched his fist and pressed it under the tip of his nose, barely blocking a little bit of bad smell. He looked at the prisoner's lips and read his words, you said you recognize me. Nonsense. Hell if you don't recognize it. The prisoner still gritted his teeth and said silently, I recognize you, you are the chief executive Chu, why didn't your old winter melon subordinate follow you, eh? Speaking of this messy thing, Chus was disheartened. It's not that the group of prisoners in the space prison can only stare at the metal wall all day long. After all, driving this group of people crazy is not good for anyone. They have a fixed time every day to use some simple equipment. Every prison area will have a huge screen, carousel showing some things that the government wants them to see, interspersed with irrelevant entertainment programs. Commonly known as round the clock without interruption to slap a jujube-style brainwashing. The selection and arrangement of these programs are in charge of the propaganda officers of the 5th office of the security building. The propaganda officer is called Zild Feng, an old man of mixed blood. Although it was Truth's subordinate, the old man was older than Truth X2, and he helped Truth twice when he first entered the security building, so Truth was slightly more tolerant of him. As a result, this bald old man pushed his nose to his face, and often did something that made Truss extraordinarily distressing. For example, on the 150th anniversary of the establishment of the space prison, The old man proposed to record a video to commemorate it, by the way, to sound the alarm for the group of agitators in the prison. He claimed that good-looking people are not easy to be hated, and he stole the footage of Truth's presentation at the security meeting in that broken video. That unlucky clip took up 4/5 of the entire video for an hour, and the remaining 1/5 was exactly half the opening and half the ending. The old man kept this video on the big screen of the space prison without saying a word for a whole day, but Chus's preaching content was about improving the prisoner controller encryption system. This is like advocating for reinforcement of collars and chains in front of a group of captured wolves. Isn't this a stimulus? Fortunately, the old man went to Truth's office to beg for compliments. As a result, he entered the door with his front foot, and Su Young was stimulated to break into the communication channel of Truth's office with his back foot. Truth had to thank the old man's 8 generations of ancestors and blasted him out of the door. Although Chus is in charge of the space prison, the prisoners are only familiar with his name, and few have seen him look like him. Since the end of the video carousel one day, Toziled Bald Feng's Fu, and terrorists throughout the prison have firmly remembered his face, and probably will not forget it in the next life. The unreasonable Chief Truth has a principle: he can see that he can't stop his hatred, and others can just wait to find and clean up his hatred for him. After all, Chief Chu is not a thing. So the next day, Zilder Bald Feng received an official letter from abroad, and he was smashed into the space prison, holding an old winter-gored face, and spending 10 days happily with the terrorists. After being remembered by everyone, he was transferred back in tears. But as soon as my eyes closed and opened, this was all 52 years ago, and I don't know what happened to the old man who was rushing to make trouble. The safety building where they work is also in a certain dragon pillar protection circle, but I don't know which corner of the Zingai they have wandered to, how far they are from here, and whether they might meet again. Truth hasn't had time to think about this kind of uncertain matter. He raised his eyebrows at the prisoner and said, "Thank you, I haven't seen the subordinate of that old winter melon for a long time, but he should be doing well, at least he didn't get into the cage." "Prisoner," I said, "my dear, if you add 2 more sentences, you can die here." Sahi casually found a dining table and leaned on the edge, watching the play in a relaxed manner for a long time. "Dead fish, dead shrimp. How can you eat it?" Truth rarely felt that Sae was right, and he honorably adopted this sincere suggestion. He sighed and put his hand into the cage carelessly. The prisoner immediately opened his eyes and yelled silently, "If you get closer to 1 centimeter, I will make you regret entering this door." Chu Si endured for a moment, couldn't hold back, and calmly said, "If your hands weren't handcuffed to the edge of the cage, and your knees weren't cuffed to the bottom of the cage, I might be able to barely use this as a threat." The prisoner's high blood pressure is about to be out by him. Truth didn't do anything to him, he just pulled away his long tangled hair with a look of disgust, revealing the upper half of his neck. I saw a thin wire on the headband, like a delicate and low-key collar. It's just that at the interface of the collar, there is a small piece of metal with a red light flashing quietly on the edge. This thing is indeed a device equipped in the space prison, called a sound-absorbing coil, to limit prisoners who suddenly roar in a manic manner. However, according to the regulations, the sound-absorbing coil is only a transitional device under the condition of last resort, and the prisoners are brought only to avoid the endless roaring to cause large-scale restlessness. Once the ring is placed, the prisoner should be sent to a special detention room immediately, and medical and psychological counseling devices should be borrowed to calm him down. Generally speaking, it can be picked in half an hour. At the moment, this situation is obviously out of compliance. Chu Si touched the metal plate with his thumb, the red light dimmed for 3 seconds, then suddenly changed to green light, and the interface made a click, and it was automatically unlocked. The prisoner did not expect that Truth would release himself, but he was stunned for a moment, and said suspiciously, "What do you want to do?" After roaring for a long time, the prisoner's voice was dumb into sandpaper. Truss didn't retract his hand either, just leaning on the edge of the cage, and said, "Don't worry, I won't say anything until you get rid of the bad smell, but I just leave a word that makes it easier to understand the facts." As he said, he turned his head and raised his chin at Sae. "Come on, interrogate suspect number 1 first, and tell me how much you made when you escaped from prison." Sahi didn't care about his tone at all, but smiled. He was not conscious of being interrogated at all. He sat lazily on the edge of the dining table, dragging the tone, and said, "Reporter, you have wronged me. I walked very low-key, not even the prison guards were alarmed, just took one away. Jump cabin." When he speaks, he likes to squint his eyes slightly, tapping his fingers on the edge of the table like playing the piano, as if he is really reminiscing the process. Chus didn't believe it. "Nothing." Sahi thought for a while, his tapping fingers stopped. "Nothing." Chus raised his eyebrows. "Really gone?" Sahi nodded innocently. "Really?" Chus expressionlessly, "Liar." Ser suddenly laughed again, raised his hand with a very small gap between his thumb and forefinger, squinted one eye, and said, "Before leaving, on a whim, he made a small prank." "Truth? What kind of prank?" "Black into the fuel tank, give them the main valve and power mechanism." Sahi replied. "Truth? You call this a little prank?" "Of course, they reacted after I left." Sahi spread his hands. "I don't know what happened after that, but it won't be a major event. After all, I haven't walked for a few days." After listening to Truth, he subconsciously wanted to interrogate the second suspect in the cage, but he suddenly remembered the information he had received, and couldn't help but ask Sarah again, "No, what did you just say?" "I haven't left for a few days." "What do you mean by not leaving for a few days? Didn't you escape from prison 27 years ago?"